Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Jennifer Nordstrom, and I'm honored to serve as the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's senior minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all you're bringing with you today and all your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests who are joining us today. If you're visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat now and tell us where you're joining us from? I welcome everyone into our worship service by inviting you to repeat our first church mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Let's go now to our beloved sanctuary to light the chalice, which is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
Good morning. My name's Kevin Gibson, and I'm pleased to be your worship associate today. I was born in a provincial English town called Grantham. It used to be said that the quickest road out of Grantham is a bottle of gin. It's the birthplace of Isaac Newton and Margaret Thatcher. When I was growing up, it had two large factories that dominated the life of the town, but no more. It was blue-collar and blue-collar conservative. I was something of a cuckoo. My parents were both the children of military who'd served abroad in the colonies, and they lived through the Second World War. I grew up in government-subsidized housing, and life was somewhat frugal. Neither my mom nor dad finished high school. I have a brother and sister, and they both left school at 16. We didn't have many books in the house, didn't listen to records, or have much political discussion. Our family reflected many of the prevailing views of the time. It was accepted that immigration was bad, other races were inferior, and there was a natural order to things where you should know your station in life and deal with it. I wasn't aware of people of color in the town until I was 15 and didn't know of anyone Jewish, let alone out-of-the-closet LGBTQ individuals. Social mobility was unusual. Now, I did well at school and passed the exam given to 10-year-olds, which allowed me to go to the local grammar school. Along the way, I was advised to lose my regional accent if I wanted to get on in life, and that's why I sound more like Lord Grantham than his servants. At 16, I had sufficient qualifications to work in a bank, which my parents thought would be ideal. Instead, I went on to study at university, at a time when only 7% of the population did. I majored in philosophy, which is about as far from the manual labor of the grimy Grantham factory as one can get. But there was a cost. My parents had a certain worldview, and mine changed. I became more liberal than they were about almost everything. They were smart and kind people, but we came to see things in very different ways. I did argue with them and confronted them over some of their beliefs. But their experiences and convictions were pretty entrenched, and frankly, all my liberal reading could never compete with the views they had, and the ones they'd cultivated through a lifetime. Some topics were simply intractable. I wish that I could have had them encounter my church, where the mind is engaged and not merely soothed. I know in my core the rightness and integrity of equality, justice, and human dignity, and so fortunate to have a spiritual home with my fellow UUs. I wish that they could have met my fellow congregants. Let me digress for a moment and consider the phrase we see all the time, keep calm and carry on. The story behind the phrase is surprisingly sinister. During the Second World War, all British residents were issued gas masks and required to carry them at all times. My grandparents still had them in a shed when I was a kid. So the poster was born, but not as a take it easy type bumper sticker slogan, but as a response to an imminent threat. The carry on has a double meaning. Take your gas mask with you and trying to maintain normalcy and composure as best you can. To me, the lesson is that even in the most trying of circumstances, we still have to find ways to carry on. In my case, keeping some kind of channel open with those I cared about. And in the face of conflict and frustration, we still have to respect the dignity and worth of people, even if we don't respect their views. I'm sure that my parents saw my beliefs as hopelessly naive and unrealistic. It wasn't at all satisfying to think that I developed differing political and social outlooks from those I loved. Bluntly, we generally didn't go there. It seems inadequate, and we avoided repeated confrontations, to be sure. And I truly regret that I couldn't bring them to see what I am convinced are bedrock truths. I tried, and then I stopped. Instead, I found worth in being together, making tea, watching soap operas, and talking about the weather. Trivial as many of those conversations were, it meant that we still at least were able to maintain some connection. Perhaps carrying on isn't the best response, but it was pretty much all we had. And, at least, it meant that we didn't have to resort to the gin.
Break not the circle of living love, where people grow forgiving and forgiving. Break not the circle, make it wider still, till it includes embraces all the living. Come wander art this love that comes to life, where words of freedom are with humor spoken, and people keep no score of wrong and guilt, but will that human bonds remain unbroken. Join then the movement of the love that frees, till people of whatever race or nation will truly be themselves, stand on their feet, see eye to eye with laughter and elation.
Conflict is a normal part of life. It happens in our homes, in our congregations, in our families and our communities. How do we approach conflict as Unitarian Universalists? How do we live our values of honoring every person's inherent worth when people deeply, angrily, sometimes hurtfully disagree? I'm going to tell you two stories. First, in one of our Unitarian Universalist congregations, there was a straight white woman in her 60s, well-educated, well-off. We'll call her Marge, who had been in a number of conflicts in the congregation. In each of these conflicts, mediators on the congregation's right relationship team helped the people involved come to agreement and move forward. However, although the individual disagreements were each coming to a resolution, Marge's pattern of being in conflict with a lot of different people continued on. Eventually, the right relationship team dug a little deeper into Marge's pattern of conflict and noticed some similar features within that pattern. Now, Marge disagreed with a lot of people, a lot of the time, which was fine. Our Unitarian Universalist faith is open to healthy disagreement. We know that conflict is normal. Indeed, it is an inevitable part of human life. We encourage curiosity and wonder and doubt and the exchange of ideas. But this was more than a person with strong opinions getting into regular disagreements. When the Right Relationship team explored the pattern of Marge's conflicts, they noticed that the conflicts that escalated to the point of needing mediation had marked power differences between Marge and the other person. In the escalated conflicts, Marge, in a patterned way, had more power than the other person with whom she was in conflict. And the ways in which she had more power fell along some pretty disappointing lines of identity. Marge got into the deepest conflicts with younger women, with people of color, and with LGBTQ folks. When someone had multiple of these identities, like a young queer person of color, the conflict got particularly nasty. This was more than just people disagreeing with one another. It was a pattern of one person trying to assert power and dominance over people with marginalized identities. Story number 2. In another one of our Unitarian Universalist congregations, a queer Indian woman in her 30s, let's call her Mallory, was invited to join the board of trustees after a couple of months of attending the congregation. In that time, she noticed that her opinion was pretty regularly sought out about issues of race, but was dismissed on LGBTQ issues. Even though Mallory felt the invitation to the board was a bit rushed, she agreed in the hopes that she could do some good in the congregation. She advocated for the congregation to participate in a white supremacy teach-in, even though there was some resistance from longtime church leaders. Afterwards, she followed up with the board to ask how they would implement the recommendations from that teach-in, particularly doing a church-wide racism audit and adopting the proposed 8th Unitarian Universalist principle on dismantling racism in order to become a multicultural community. For 4 consecutive months, her request to the board was sidelined in one way or another. Finally, in month 5, Mallory persisted in getting the item on the agenda. In the board meeting, she shared her frustration that the issue of working on anti-racism had been sidelined for so long. The white board secretary reacted to Mallory's complaint defensively, framing it as a personal attack on her rather than an institutional critique. It was a difficult board meeting, and no solutions were reached. Mallory writes about her relationship with the community during this period. She says, "My relationship with the board members in question soured, and several church members engaged in a whisper campaign against me, seemingly targeting my social justice views, with one member joking that I had issued a fatwa against mentioning US presidents in sermons after I'd related some complaints about an Independence Day reflection." Mallory stopped attending services, finished up her board term, and left the congregation. Both of these stories are true, though some details have been changed to make them less recognizable. One of them was shared with me by a colleague, and the other one can be found in the Widening the Circle of Concern report by the Unitarian Universalist Association's Commission on Institutional Change. Now we can notice some similarities in these stories. In each one, An individual comes into conflict broadly in a community. The congregations in each story struggle to be in relationship with the individual, and the individual becomes ostracized from the community. In both instances, the individual eventually leaves the community. A flat, uncomplicated read of universalism might just leave the comparison there. Our Universalist theological tradition holds that every human being is beloved, worthy, and sacred. It comes from our Universalist theological ancestors who argued against the concept of hell because of their belief that God's love was larger than any finite human sin, and thus salvation must be universal. In contemporary terms, we might reframe this as by saying that every human being's worth is inherent and no one is ever removed from the circle of human concern. Or we might say that every human being is a sacred and beloved child of God, or beloved child of the earth, or a beloved child of love. Our first principle in Unitarian Universalism, that we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, codifies this theology. Sometimes I hear Unitarian Universalists use a flat, uncomplicated version of universalism when faced with conflict, whether that conflict is in our congregations or in their personal lives. When struggling with how to honor a person's inherent worth if we find their thinking vile, a flat reading of universalism might trap us into believing that if we honor everyone's inherent worth and dignity, then everyone's views are equally valid. I hear people wrestling with disagreeing with their homophobic uncle or their racist neighbor, but then also acknowledging that that person disagrees with them too, and thinking that our universalist understanding of them both as inherently worthy means that the disagreement is equal. Both sides are valid. But there is more to our theological heritage than a bland, both sides are valid approach to conflict. Our Unitarian theological tradition honors reason and the application of critical thinking to theology. Also, our Universalists held that we should work together to create the beloved community here on earth. Our faith tradition has a long practice of siding with justice and examining human behaviors and practices to make them more just and equitable. We use our reason to apply the theology of universalism to the realities of the human world. All things being equal, we could simply say, yes, everyone is inherently worthy, but we well know that in the world, all things are not equal. There are long histories of racism and patriarchy and exploitation of working people and homophobia and xenophobia and all kinds of exclusionary and oppressive practices and structures that make people's lived realities of the world very different. We are not ignorant of the realities of the world or its history, nor are we afraid to tell the truth about it. Liberation theology argues that the holy is invested in the liberation of the oppressed, that God's self is on the side of justice, that love wants to dismantle racism and patriarchy and exploitation. In the United States, Black liberation theology originated in the 1960s from Black Christian theologians who said Jesus sided with the marginalized. He was himself oppressed and marginalized, and he came to liberate people from oppression. Black liberation theologian James Cone said that in the US context of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, race is such a marker of dominance and oppression that here, Jesus is Black. Latin American Catholic liberation theology originated also in the 1960s through priests and bishops in Latin America who said that because Jesus sided with the marginalized, was himself oppressed and marginalized, and came to liberate people from oppression, Jesus's ministry was evidence of God's preferential option for the poor. Liberation theology recognizes that things are not equal in this world. It examines the inequality, and it identifies God or holiness or sacredness or the love of the world with the movement to dismantle inequality and transform injustice. A more complicated view of our Unitarian Universalist theology combines universalism with liberation theology to arrive in a place where all human beings, yes, are sacred and worthy, and therefore we do the work together to dismantle injustice in the world so that we can begin to live in ways that actually do honor the inherent worth of all. When we apply this understanding to our two UU stories, we're able to move beyond a flat, both sides version of inclusivity and into a more complicated analysis of power that reflects our real desire to live the truth of inherent worth by transforming injustice. In the first story, Marge not only has a number of identities that give her power in her congregation. She's white, she's straight, she's in her 60s, she's well educated, well off, but she also has a pattern of engaging in serious conflict with people who have less power than her. In our second story, Mallory not only has a number of identities that reduce her power in her community. She's younger, she's Indian, she's queer. She also experiences a pattern of the power structures in her community dismissing her challenges to injustice in one of the areas of her marginalized identities. In the first story, Marge is enacting patterns of domination, and she leaves the community when it holds her accountable for that behavior. In the second story, Mallory was challenging patterns of domination in her community, and she left her community when it would not be held accountable for those patterns of behavior. We are not trapped in a shallow universalism that flattens in the face of conflict. Rather, we can take our reason, our understanding of the world and how it works upon our lives, and then explore how we should treat each other in specific circumstances in order to actually honor everyone's inherent worth. Using reason to understand how power dynamics work in the real world can make a difference in conflict. It deepens our universalism and leads us to liberation. It leads us to make changes in our lives and in our institutions that encourage universal human flourishing. Analyzing how power makes a difference in conflict helps us understand that in our two stories, Marge needs to stop her behavior and be held accountable for it. And that in Mallory's community, the congregation needs to listen to her challenging injustice and hold itself accountable for resisting the transformation of injustice. I want to be clear, though. Analyzing power doesn't mean flattening conflict to identity either. It's not that people with dominant identities are always working for domination, or that people with marginalized identities are always working to dismantle domination. That's not true. I know a lot of well-educated white women in their 60s who are working their butts off to dismantle oppression. Get it, ladies? And I know a lot of people with marginalized identities who are working to shore up domination along traditional lines of power. No, our analysis is about noticing the systems of domination and then collaborating with allies of all identities to dismantle those systems. Liberation and universalism are not opposing theologies. They're partners in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. Understanding and connecting both of these pieces of our theological heritage not only helps us maintain our identity and our ethics when we are in conflict, it also helps us maintain our relationship with those with whom we ethically disagree. We can tell the truth and be compassionate at the same time. A universalist liberation theology maintains that no one is removed from the circle of human concern. Not your homophobic uncle or your racist neighbor, not Marge, not Mallory, not either of their congregations. Universalist liberation theology doesn't flatten the conflicts because it knows that racism and homophobia are blocks to universal human flourishing, but it still holds out hope for everyone to find their way to liberation. Your homophobic uncle is not beyond redemption. As long as he's alive, there's still the possibility that he might learn more and grow in this lifetime. In Kevin's story this morning, he expressed the desire, he wished that he could have introduced his parents to this congregation. He maintained his relationship with them, holding out hope for further connection. He talked about how he's come to terms with living with his parents, acknowledging that continued toxicity of ideas, keeping his gas mask handy to protect, but also not cutting them off. A liberationist universalism believes they are not cut off, that no one is cut off from the circle of human concern. No one is beyond the hope that they might grow into a support for universal human flourishing. Perhaps you have someone in your life who is opposed or resistant to universal liberation, or maybe who makes it hard for you to believe in universal liberation. You might even be able to feel your resistance or your frustration in your body right now. Take a moment and just send the place of tension in yourself some love. Now take another moment and send some love out to everyone who is suffering from their lack of access to universal liberation. Regardless of our identities, and regardless of our views about our identities, we all suffer from a world which is not free. People with dominant identities suffer from the spiritual toxicity of illusions of superiority and the way that those illusions separate them from the whole. People with marginalized identities suffer from oppression and from barriers to resources and whole human flourishing. People with both marginalized and dominant identities, which is most of us, suffer in some toxic superiority and some oppression, and also suffer from having an internal battle of whose identity comes to the fore, and sometimes having to suppress parts of ourselves. Universal liberation, liberatory universalism is for everyone. It's freedom for everyone. It's for Marge and for Mallory. It's for both of their congregations. It's for you and for me and your homophobic uncle and my racist neighbor. It's for the people who have been marginalized. It centers the people who have been marginalized, because centering the marginalized is how we free ourselves from supremacy systems and domination, because the marginalized are able to define them and explain them and help us understand how to deconstruct them. And that deconstruction creates freedom for everyone. People with dominant identities get free from the need to dominate, get free from the spiritual rot of superiority. People with marginalized identities get free from the barriers and the pain of oppression. People who hold both dominant and marginalized identities get free from having to choose among our identities or silence parts of ourselves. We all get free from the confines of identity enforcement and dominance and oppression. Everyone in universalism that is liberatory gets access to the resources we need to flourish in the world, and the walls of separation and pain between and among us dwindle. We get to spend our time and our energy on creating, on beauty and love and art and joy, instead of on competition and power. Learning about our identity's power dynamics helps us get free from them, helps us lay them down and live with one another in ways that truly honor the unique and beautiful contributions of our souls to the world. It helps us hold on to who we are and know we belong to one another. Let's get free together, folks. May it be so, and amen. It has been a blessing to be together. May you go out from here nourished and renewed, and use that to choose to bless the world. Until we meet again, may you be held, may you be healed, may you be whole. Blessed be, and amen.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa, yeah, yeah. Whoa.